Have you ever tried to troubleshoot something in Home Assistant? Well, logs are going to be your best friend. Today we're going to take some simple logs and do some simple troubleshooting with those logs. We'll also talk about the recorder feature, which allows you to view specific history items within Home Assistant. And just take a moment to hit that subscribe button. I know 70% of you are not subscribers that watch my videos. Really helps the channel grow, really helps keep this channel alive, and helps me be able to make these videos for you. So let's get started. What makes Home Assistant so good is the fact that they have a lot of documentation for setting up various features within Home Assistant. So today we're going to follow along with a few of those documents. You can see those here under Home Assistant I/O Integrations Logger, Home Assistant I/O Integrations System Log, and Home Assistant I/O Integrations Recorder. And we're going to spend time with each one of those today. The Logger integration lets you define the level of logging activities in Home Assistant. You can go all the way from critical to information, and that limits the amount of stuff that goes within your log file and also limits your size. I know there's been a lot of questions about how do I limit the size of my log file. Well, this is one of the ways you can do that. Only logging critical information or debug information or info will determine how much stuff is stored in your logs. Now, I know you're going to say, how do I remove the log files? And the answer is, it's not easy, and I haven't found a good way to do that. When I do, I will make a video on that. But right now, we're just going to try to limit what we put in the log files if we don't need anything extra. What you need to do first is make sure that in your configuration.yaml file that you have a logger entry. And I can show you that here in mine under configuration YAML. I have a logger entry, and the default currently I have set to debug. And we can look and see what that means within Home Assistant. So if we go down to the different log levels, you can see critical, fatal, error, warning, warn, info debug, and not set. And each one of those provides a different level of output. So I've set mine to debug, and that gives me a lot of information on what's going on within my environment. Now, if we go through and we look at the documentation for this, there are a number of configuration options you can use to limit the amount of stuff being logged. Actually, if you want to log everything that's just regular messages, ignore anything that's not critical, for specified components, you could set something like this example here. So logger, your default for everything is info, but let's say you only want critical information for your Yamaha and your My Integration, or whatever the component is. You would set those to critical, and you would only get information on those if it's a critical log entry. You can do the same thing for ignoring all messages lower than critical, and you log events for specified components. So you have a logger default of critical, so anything less than critical is going to be ignored, unless you have it specifically set down here. So for your Home Assistant core, you want fatal. For your Home Assistant MQTT, you want warning. Python scripts, you want warning. And you can go on and set each of these components up for the level that you want. This is going to be highly dependent on your environment and what you're trying to do. Some of you will understand this more coming from a background in, say, IT or administering servers. Others, you may not need this much information. So you can set this however you want to set this up. The log entries are also logged in the form of timestamp, log level thread, namespace messages. And the namespace is the component namespace currently logging. So for example, Home Assistant components, the namespace would be Smart Things Lite. The namespace would be Python script my new script. The namespace would be MQTT, and so on and so forth. So you would actually see the namespace and then the message. So you have various configuration variables, obviously default. And then logs give you the ability to set other options. And then all the log information is stored in the configuration directory as home-assistant.log. You can read it if you're SSHing to the device with either a command line tool called cat, or you can tail it. And those of you who have experienced administering Linux servers and stuff like that will understand this. You can also look at it directly within the Home Assistant UI, which we'll look at in just a minute. So let's say you want to watch the log file as things are going along. You can do a tail -F or -F and then the log file, and it will just continually stroll the entries in the log file for you. Docker can do the same thing. Docker logs follow and then the container ID. And there's a whole bunch of other options you can do. So what does the log file look like? So if I go over to my Home Assistant instance and I pull up the configuration and I scroll down here to logs, I'm going to see the Home Assistant log here. And these are all the entries that have been generated. Now you can see, since I'm running a debug level, I'm going to get errors and I'm going to get warnings. And so all of these things have been logged into my Home Assistant log. Some of them, well, I would say most of them are not an issue because my Home Assistant seems to be running just fine. If you have an error where something isn't working correctly, then definitely come over to the logs and take a look. What we have here is, let's just take a few of these entries. Let me blow it up so you can see a little bit better here. So this says new -000 uncaught. Now I will say right off the bat that some of these things are cryptic and may not be understandable. Something in one of these Python scripts is causing an issue. And one of the things you can do is look at the log file details. And the log file details are going to give you a little bit more information. Also, they've added a feature where you can copy the log file entry, the details here, and then you can put those into an issue on GitHub or whatever the support forum is for the particular component or namespace that's having a problem. So if we look up here on this one again, it just basically says that for whatever reason, it can't find whatever this is. This is not something I'm going to troubleshoot right now, but you can go in here and you can take some of this information. Now this is specific to my instance here, so it's not going to be helpful necessarily to search for this string here, but you can see something like maybe frontend.js.latest and then put in something like uncaught and just see if that shows up in Google anywhere. And that may be something that'll help you find out what the problem is. You may be reading through a forum and see the same thing in there as well. Then we have the next one here is a warning. So Home Assistant Cloud said requested entity was not found. So the cloud.googleconfig, so the component cloud Google config says that the entity was not found. Again, that's one I would probably spend some more time on. You've got also links to documentations and issues. And this is specific to the Home Assistant Cloud. What that's probably telling me is that one of the entities that I've mapped to my Home Assistant Cloud, the Nabu Casa stuff, is not available. I'm not going to worry about that right now. Let me see if I can find something that we can actually deal with here. So here's something that's going to be more common as you upgrade your Home Assistant instances. The Ratio, which is my sprinkler controller, the option is deprecated, so I need to remove it from my configuration. So if I click on that, it just basically says the same thing. You can go to documentation, and one of the things you can look at for documentation, potentially, is how you get your Ratio stuff set up. And this will go through, and you need to make sure you have all these things set the way that this integration or add-on or namespace is supposed to be set up. And if you don't, then this takes you right to where you need to set it up and get it all set up. But what this typically means when you see an error like that is it's deprecated and we need to remove it from my configuration. Now I know through breaking changes during my upgrades that the Ratio controller no longer requires the Ratio, I'm probably saying this wrong, Ratio configuration entry and configuration.yaml, because it's now an integration that's configured through the UI. So we can actually go into our configuration and we can remove that, searching for Ratio in the configuration. See, and what this is it's telling me that I don't need this anymore. So I can come in here and I can comment out that or remove it entirely. Remove that entry in my Home Assistant configuration because now it's being configured through the UI and I don't need it in this file anymore. So that's another example. Let's go through and see what else we have. Unit of measurement is deprecated. Now this one, I'm not sure what happened here, but let's see. It's called uptime. So if you look at documentation for uptime, the platform is uptime. It's a sensor. And so it's telling me that in this particular issue that unit of measurement option is deprecated. So if I go into my sensor file, I might be able to see what's going on with that. So let me go to sensors and let me see uptime. So it does say platform uptime, HAS uptime, unit of measurement is hours. It's now telling me that this is deprecated and no longer needed. So I'm going to just comment this one out as well. So you see what we're kind of doing here. You know, I don't need to troubleshoot every single one of these things because it's going to be different for everybody. But it's a process you go through to understand what the problem is and then start looking through and how to fix it. I will take a few more of these as well and just kind of look through them. You know, you've got errors, you've got warnings, and I think here in my file, pretty much those are the two because I'm setting my system to debug. So I'm going to get errors and warnings. If there were a fatal, I'd probably get that one as well. So I'm most concerned about errors. A lot of warnings are things like this. So eventually this might turn into an error because they're going to start removing these configurations from the configuration file, especially when they put them in the UI. So what we need to do here is start looking at some of this other stuff that are actually errors. Now, error fetching speed test not, that's hard to say, speed test dot net data. I use this for my speed testing, and it said it has an error fetching that. So what I'm going to do is go into my sensors, because I know where that is. I'm going to see if it's in here. Speed test. And it's probably not. It's probably in configuration.yaml. So here's my speedtest.net. And this, for whatever reason, it can't find that. And so if we go back over here and we look at the documentation, there may be something that I've done wrong in the documentation that is preventing it from working correctly anymore. So adding speedtest.net to your home assistance can be done via the user interface by taking the following steps. We go to my instance, configuration, integrations, add integration, speedtest.net. So here's what I think the issue is, potentially, is now, just like a lot of these other things are going away within the configuration, I need to actually remove speedtest.net from here and go into integrations. So this is one where I can actually go in and configure this one from the UI. So we'll save that and we'll go into a new version or a new instance of Home Assistant. And we will, where's it at? Let's go to configuration integrations. And let's look for speed test. And here's speedtest.net. It's already configured. Okay, so what that means is that, and maybe it's already in here. Let me see. Yep, here it is. So here's an issue here. I'm not sure. Maybe the test server is the problem. So yeah, I bet you that's what it was. So this is an example of a misconfiguration. So I removed that speedtest.net from the configuration.yaml because it's not used. But what it's done now is the server wasn't set. So I'm going to submit that, and that's going to fix that problem most likely. So we can go through all of these, and I have a lot of errors in here. Part of my errors are because I migrated from the Home Assistant instance on my desktop server to my Home Assistant Blue Odroid. And so what that's doing is causing some of these things to show up. So if your Home Assistant has been running for a while, you can see the timestamps here, but you can clear the log. And you can refresh this log here. And if there are no new issues, you're good to go. A lot of the issues that you're going to see are going to show up on startup. And during that startup, it's going to see a bunch of things in your configuration. It's going to tell you about them. But they're not going to cause any problems. They won't show up in the logs later on. So if you're trying to troubleshoot an issue that's ongoing, I would clear the log files and then refresh it and watch for whatever error is that you're looking for without all the extra startup errors that are showing up. The full Home Assistant log shows you the stack trace information in a lot more detail about what's going on with the errors. You can click on that button and really dig into those errors if you want to do that, if you're skilled with looking at that stuff. So that's there for that. We're going to move on to the next thing, which I'm going to show you as the system log. This stores information about all logged errors and warnings in Home Assistant. So that's kind of where we were, configuration logs. It only stores the last 50 errors and warnings. Older entries are automatically discarded from the log, as you see here. Now you can go in here and you can set the system log in your configuration.yaml to max entries. It just means you're going to have more stuff. The only reason I would say you would necessarily need to do that is if there's just a ton of stuff going on, and whatever the error is that's going on is rolling off the end of your log file in 50 entries is just not enough for it. So you need to set this to something higher. You can also set fire events option, whether events are fired, and it's required for things like triggers. You can clear the system log by calling a service. What I didn't show you earlier was this here under supervisor. Under supervisor, you can also go to system and you can look at the logs here. Now these are the supervisor logs. You can look at the core logs, and these are all the core logs that are going on within the system, and there's a lot of them. You can also look at the host logs. Now this is more like what you would see in a typical Linux environment or OS environment where you're looking at actually what's going on the host, in this case the Odroid. You can look at DNS for errors there, and then you can look at audio. I don't know what you would do with audio necessarily, but it's there as a log. And then multicast, you can see that as well. So you can come in here and see all these different logs as well. And it's going to fail because I'm shooting a video, so that's fantastic. So anyway, the system log allows you to set those specific things. To me, the logs, it gets a little confusing because you have the location of the log file under configuration logs, which is what I started showing you. Then you have the other logs, which are the Home Assistant logs. And then the settings on the logger affect the system log as well as these other things here. So it can get a little confusing about what to set. Okay, so let's talk about Recorder for a moment because I know this is getting to be a long video. So the Recorder integration is responsible for storing details in a database, and that's handled by the history. Now on my Home Assistant instance on my Odroid, I have no history here. I did that when I was on my Raspberry Pi, and then I migrated over to my my Lenovo M82 like mini desktop because the drive just chattered all the time. And I'm storing a lot of things in Grafana, and I'm storing a lot of things in my InfluxDB, so I felt I didn't need the history. On my test site, or test setup here, you can see what the history looks like. And that's this button right here. This is all the things that are going on in my Home Assistant device that is on the Raspberry Pi 4. And it just stores this stuff in history. And the reason that works is I've got the logger set up here, or the recorder set up. So if I go to my configuration.yaml file, it's defaulted already to my default configuration, and the default configuration is just going to record everything. So under Recorder, you can specify the things that you want to be recorded and remove other things. So you have a choice of includes. So if you have no includes or no excludes, you're going to record everything that goes on. So the history will be everything that happens. And one of the things you can do when you have that like that is you can take a quick glance at something. So if I want to look at my CPU temperature over time, this is what's stored by the recorder in the history file. If I go back to my main setup here on my primary and I click on one of these values, you'll notice that I have no history here, and that's because I have the recorder option turned off. So if you want something like this and you want the history, you need to make sure you have recorder enabled. Now if you have 100 different devices, you're going to have a lot of information in here, and it's going to be a big mess. So my recommendation is you go through the recorder setup here and you start looking at some configuration. One of the other things to note here is that the integration continuously saves the data. It uses the SD card if you're on a Raspberry Pi. It basically stores it on the primary device that you have Home Assistant on. So with an SD card, you're going to continually write that SD card. It's going to potentially affect your system reaction time. It's going to potentially shorten the life expectancy of your SD card. One of the things that they recommend is setting this commit interval to 30 seconds or higher. That limits the amount of stored data, and also excluding devices that you don't need or storing this data on another system. So Home Assistant used SQL or SQL Alchemy. It's an ORM, or Object Relational Mapper. So you can use any SQL backend to store the data. So you can use MySQL, MariaDB, Postgres, or MS SQL. And then the default, of course, is SQLite. It doesn't require any configuration. If you do that, you just turn it on. And then the database is actually stored in the config directory, and it's named Home-Assistant v2 DB. Now you can change a bunch of defaults like we talked about in your configuration file. So you can change where the database is. So you could actually store the recorder database on a different device in a different location. You would use the URL for that. Max retries, how many times it'll try to connect to the database, the wait time, the integrity check, auto purge, number of days to keep it. So you can automatically purge the database every night at 4:12 a.m. Purging keeps the database from growing indefinitely, which takes up disk space and can make Home Assistant slow. You can create an automation to call the recorder purge periodically if you don't use auto purge. So let's say you want to clear it out once a week. You could create an automation to do that. Your commit interval is how often, and that's what we talked about, 30 seconds or more. It's how often the events and state changes are sent to the database. So it'll kind of build that up and then send it all over. The default of 1 allows events to be committed almost instantaneously. Increasing this reduces disk I/O, may prolong the SD card life, and the trade-off being that the history is going to lag a little bit. If you set it to 0, commits are made as soon as possible, even after an event's processed, which means you're just slamming that all the time. So again, your choice on how you want to set this up. So you can exclude domains, entity globs, entities, or event types, and then you can include domains, entity globs. So here's an example. So in this case, they're including the alarm control panel, the lights, and any binary sensor that has occupancy attached to it. They're excluding the kitchen light. So this is an example of an exclude and include combined that gives you very specific tailoring of what you want to record in your history file. So here are how the filters work. So with no includes or excludes, you're going to pass all the entities. With includes and no excludes, you're going to only include things. So the example is if you have 100 or more devices and you only want 5, it makes more sense to do an include rather than an exclude because you're only including 5 rather than excluding 100 or 95. The same thing applies to excludes and no includes. Let's say you want everything but 5 devices. You would exclude those 5 devices and keep the 95 others. That would be automatically included because they're not part of the exclude list. And then if you have both, like we talked about just an example above, you'll have just those devices included that you have in the include section, and everything else in the exclude will be excluded. All the rest of that stuff just gets ignored. So the only things acted on are the includes and excludes in that example. If you only want to hide events from your history, take a look at the history integration. The same goes for Logbook. So the Logbook integration actually provides a little bit different look at the history of your house. It shows all the changes that happen to your house in reverse chronological order. And if we look at mine, I have a logbook enabled here. And I can see all the things that happen in reverse chronological order in my logbook. And I can choose the date range for that. And I can choose it by entity. So if I want to see the power status, nothing changed. These are only things that have changed over time. And you can see here the guest speaker change was basically the only thing that's happened over the last 24 hours, or the last 3 hours. 7, 8, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, 3 hours. And that's only because this test setup doesn't have much to it. All right, so you can use Logbook as well. The integration is default enabled, so you already have it anyway. Unless you remove the default config, and in here we look at this and we have default config. I know it's kind of hard to see, but we have default config enabled. That means all these things are already turned on, so that one would be as well. So you have the same thing, exclude, include for that, and then you have a configure filter. And so the Logbook basically follows the same kind of setup for that as the recorder does. And then they go through some specific filtering examples, which we talked about a little bit. And there's a service purge. So you can call the recorder purge to start a purge task. That deletes all the events and states older than X days according to the keep days service data. So if I wanted to record or exclude everything 7 days and back, I would say record a purge, and then I would say the data would be 7, and that would keep 7 days worth of data. You can also do a repack, and that repack will rewrite the entire database. When using MySQL or Maria, it'll optimize or recreate the events and states table. It's a very heavy operation. It takes a lot of resources and slows things down. So use that as you really need to. So what I wanted to kind of do today is just talk through a little bit about what the different logging features are and what the recording feature is, and then also the logbook feature and how you can do some basic troubleshooting. By no means is that an exhaustive way to do troubleshooting, but it allows you to start looking through your log files and start to correct things. And it's especially true as you're looking at the log files and you upgrade Home Assistant over time. There will be things that will be deprecated. For the most part, they put in there that those things are deprecated for a while. In other words, they give you warnings, and it allows you to correct them and update them to the new way that configuration should be before they shut it off completely or start, breaking things. So it's important to go through those log files every once in a while and see what's going on within your system. Obviously, I need to do that too, because you can see the number of things that are in my log file that are causing problems. So the other thing to do is, if you want to limit the amount of space this stuff is using, use the purge functions, and then go in there and set your log file to only the level that you really need. I would never set it to info. You just fill your log file with all kinds of stuff. Keep it at debug, keep it at fatal, keep it at warning, keep it at critical. The things that really will affect your system that you need to know about. Debug to start with. That way you can see all the things that need to be adjusted, like I showed you on mine. So I hope this was helpful. I know it was a longer video. It's really, and it wasn't really that in depth, but I do answer questions on my Discord. I do answer questions on the comments here on the videos. If you're not a subscriber, and I know that 70% of you that watch my videos are not subscribing, please hit that subscribe button. If you like the video, hit the thumbs up button. Ask me questions down below. Again, hit me up on Discord, and then we will see you on the next video.